Thank you very much, Dana. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this hour. I see that there's some folks that have hung out with me before, and so I applaud you for returning for more. For those that have not hung out with me, there are a couple of things I want to go over real quick. There will be several times that you'll be asked to talk to folks sitting next to you, folks in the room. If you're in the room by yourself, please feel free to talk to yourself. It's one of the best ways to learn information. This is going to be a super webinar where we're going to talk about how to build little brains better. It's something we're all interested in because we want to be better at our job and we want student achievement and growth to go up while our stress level goes down. But to be successful, there are a couple of must-haves. Get ready for the day. So I'm going to show you a quick list of things that I think you must have in the room with you to make this webinar successful. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to read it and gather those things, and then we'll get started. Here's the list. So the things we're going to need to make this webinar success is your brain. More on that later. Your own amazing ideas because you know your job better and the children you work with better than anyone else around. So we're going to need your ideas, and for that we'll need the chat room. There'll be times when we pull the chat room down, and that's because I'd like you to either talk to a neighbor, talk to yourself, or jot some things down on that piece of paper that you have in front of you as well. So something to write with is going to be helpful. If it's colorful, that's even better. A piece of paper is preferable, but if you want to use the back of your hand or your neighbor's shirt, you're certainly welcome to do that as well. So if you have all your pieces and parts ready, let's do a quick check on the chat room. If you're ready to roll, you have everything you need, please type yes into the chat room. Excellent. Thank you very much. So whether you're from Wistful, from Pocosin, from UVA, we're happy to have you. And so let's start with a quick question, a real quick question. How many of you would be interested in 3 or 4 strategies that would set the little brains you work with up for a lifetime of success and achievement? And here's the added bonus. It's going to lower your stress level. If that's you, please type "that's me" into the chat room. Excellent. Great. So the chat room is working just fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the chat room away for just a brief moment. I'll put the chat room back up, I promise. So I'm going to pull the chat room away and show you 6 basic statements and give you about 30 seconds to read those statements to yourself. So these 6 statements, I didn't tell you the whole story behind these 6 statements. Some of these statements are absolutely true, some of them are false, and some of them are partly true and partly false. So what I'd like you to do now is with that sheet of paper or your neighbor's hand or your neighbor's shirt, jot down which of these statements you think are true, which ones you think are false, and if you've got someone in the room to debate with, you might want to debate it out. You have about 1.5 minutes to sort this out, which ones are true and which ones are false. Go. We have about 30 more seconds to sort this out. All right, so let's take a quick look at these and see what answers you came up with. So we're going to keep the chat room closed for just a second longer, and then I'm going to ask for your input on a couple of these questions. So number 1, Let's do a quick vote, really quick, with number one. Just very quickly in the chat, how did you respond to number one? Is number one true or false? Type a T or an F into the chat room for that. All right. So it looks like it's quite a mixed bag. Some believe it's false, some believe it's true, some have a capital F, some have a capital T. So it may be that you feel strongly about this one, but this one's actually false. Playing Mozart will not improve the students' math scores. In fact, this is a myth that's been generated for several years now called the Mozart effect. And what we know is that music, although it does produce responses in brains and brain chemistry, what it does to math scores really is an unfounded truth. So we don't believe that that's the case at all. In fact, one of the best ways to improve math scores is to exercise good self-control as a young brain. And we'll get more on that later. Excellent. Number two, take a quick second and type in what you think number two is. True or false? Number two, type it in. Excellent. So this is tough. And see, as we move through the true and false questions, these will get tougher to answer, not because you don't know, but because, well, you think I'm trying to trick you, but this is really some good stuff. So exposing an infant or toddler to language DVDs, believe it or not, a study that was published just recently in 2007 in the Journal of Pediatrics, it actually slows development. It slows language development, and it can alter intelligence in a negative way, especially when it comes to vocabulary. So you can even get refunds for a lot of these DVDs. One of the things we'll talk about in the next few minutes is why that's the case. In other words, why is it that language DVDs and CDs don't do what we thought they do, or what the infomercial at 2 a.m. says they do? We're going to get to that. So, when rewarding a child, you should always praise his or her effort. Take a quick second, true or false with that one. Praise his or her effort. Excellent. We are all over this one. So a lot of truths have popped up. That is a true statement. If we get too hung up on right and wrong, it actually improves extrinsic motivation, when really what we want to do early on is improve intrinsic motivation. We want them to be lifelong learners. And so guess what? Praising his or her effort helps promote that. Number four, children will find their own happiness. This is false. This is a false statement. In fact, we know children would much rather be in social environments and interact with other peers and certainly other folks. And that's one of the ways we develop happiness, the idea of socialization. And that's going to be very important. Number five, baby brains are basically miniature versions of adult brains. We're all early childhood folks on this phone line and on this webinar. So let's see if we can get this. Baby brains are basically miniature versions of adult brains. Type in what you believe the answer to that. Right on the money. Right on the money. This is good news. We're off to a good start for a Tuesday afternoon. This is excellent. So baby brains are not miniature versions. In fact, they're fundamentally different. We're going to talk about what those fundamental differences are and how we can use that in what we do for our careers. Number six, the very last one, the last true and false question, I promise. Emotions are hardwired into a baby's brain, meaning that some are happier and some are not. What do you think of this one? Take a quick second, type it into the chat room. Good job. So we've got some folks on the webinar that are on to me, and this is the secret. It's actually true and false. In other words, some of our emotions are hardwired. By the way, there are 6, and I'm going to give you those 6 emotions at the end of the webinar. Before we exit today, you will get the 6 hardwired emotions, but the other 996 plus emotions are actually learned through direct social interaction, and it's going to play a huge role in the type of environments we create. So before we move on, take a quick look at your screen and a quick look at your answers. I'm going to give you about 47 and a half seconds to go through and make notes about this slide. If you've got someone in the room with you, talk to them. If you're by yourself, talk to yourself. Just anything you want to remember from this slide, because we're going to revisit it throughout the hour. Take about 37 seconds. Check it out. Right. So I'm going to type in. There was a great question that popped up in the chat room about the citation or the reference for the DVDs, the language DVDs. I'm going to just type that in very quickly so that everyone can have a good look at that. And it's in the Academy or the Journal of Pediatrics. And so if you do a Google search for Zimmerman et al. 2007 in the Journal of Pediatrics, you'll see the exact study that I'm referencing there, and you'll actually see the DVD program they were talking about. But we do believe that it is generalizable to other DVDs, and we will talk about it later on in the webinar. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to close out the chat room because I want to redirect our attention to that sheet of paper in front of you or your neighbor's hand or your neighbor's shirt and the colorful item you chose to write with. So we're going to close the chat for just a few moments. On that sheet of paper, I'd like to give you a task. If someone were to walk up to you and ask you, what is an enriched environment? What is an enriched environment? What does it look like? What are some of the characteristics you would list down there? So on your sheet of paper with your writing utensil, what makes up an enriched environment? What parts are there involved? So take about a minute and jot down what you believe an enriched environment to be. Take about 30 more seconds to make your list about an enriched environment. About 30 more seconds. That's tons of time. All right. So if you would, please pause right where you are because we're going to do something else with that list. On that list, you probably have your favorite or one that you think has the most impact or one that makes the biggest amount of difference. So I'm going to open up the chat room. And if you would, please just jot in the one component of enriched environment that you think makes the biggest difference or is your own personal favorite. So quickly fill up the chat room. Affection is up. Excellent. That's a great choice. Interaction. And as a thinking adult. Environment safe, praise and communication, follow the child's lead, excellent. Social interaction, nurturing, good. Folks talking to each other, that's going to become very important in about 10 minutes. Reading books, at least one person who is crazy about the baby. I now experience that firsthand. Excellent. Multi-sensory, excellent. Good. So these are all great answers. And so here is actually what the research says. We can sum all of this information up into one word. In other words, if someone were to walk up to you and say, what does an enriched environment look like? We can sum it up in one word. And the word is save. The word is save. So on your sheet of paper, just write that down. The word save, S-A-V-E. And that is exactly what an enriched environment looks like. So what does save mean? It has a bunch of different meanings. Take a look at your screen, please. So the S in SAVE stands for sensory motor, which means all enriched environments must have heavy sensory motor components. We're going to talk about what that does for the child's brain in just a second. It must have auditory stimulation, and a lot of that has to do with language development. We're going to get to in just a second. It must have a high degree of visual stimuli because our vision is coming online in our brains. That's important. And the last thing, but certainly not the least, is the role of emotional connections and emotional nurturing. So what we're going to do next is move through each of these items, talk about what's going on in the brain, and what we can do in our jobs that directly involve early childhood brains or little baby brains, and how we can put this research into use. So before we do, very quickly, we're going to get rid of our list in just a second, but now with your list of what makes up an enriched environment, If you would please just go ahead and classify the items on your list. If something is sensory motor, put an S beside it. If something is auditory, put an A beside it. If something's visual, put a V beside it. And if something's emotional, put an E beside it. So go ahead and classify your list based on the save acronym. Take about 30 seconds to do this, and we'll get going in just a second. All right. So I'm going to close out of the chat room for just a second because I'm going to show you the first part of the webinar, the first part of the word save. It's going to be the S. And I'd like you to make that full screen. If you remember, full screen has to do with the 4 blue arrows down there on the bottom bar. So if we take a look at sensory motor development and make it full screen, it makes it a whole lot easier to read this brain research. So please make your screen full screen and take a look at the research on sensory motor development. So here's the long and short of sensory motor development. We know that sensory input and motor input are very, very closely intertwined in the brain. What's most important is that this is developed through exploration. What do we mean by exploration? Baby brains tend to develop much more efficiently if they're in an environment where they can explore and mess with things and hear the word yes, yes, yes rather than no, no, no. We know what this means because we can walk into child care centers and students or little brains will be moving around and they'll go to touch something and you go, no, 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 no. They'll go to touch something else and they'll hear, no, 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 no. That really is not an ideal environment. What we would like is an exploration type environment where everything is yes, yes, yes. What does this do? It actually activates a part of your brain called the vestibular system. That's a pretty interesting word. So very quickly, with either someone in the room with you or to yourself, just say vestibular system. Just practice pronouncing it. I'll wait a second. And so it's really key to this development. It's in your ear, which is really ironic because we think, wow, if we're talking about learning, we're really not going to go to the ear as one of the first stops. But here's what happens. When babies and little brains are moving around and getting the stimulation sensory motor style, or what I call rocking and rolling, it actually activates their vestibular system, which is very strongly linked to many of the learning centers of the brain. So then that dot on the far right at the top, early motor stimulation, leads to better attention, better listening skills, better reading scores, better writing skills, and coming to a nerd journal near you, math skills. And so we know when students have their vestibular system activated, they also bring online more mature and more developed academic systems like attention, listening, reading, and writing. So activating the vestibular system is a good thing. So now, if you would, bring your screen back off of full screen because we're going to go and do something with this. So sensory motor development makes up the S part of SAVE. So I'd like to share with you another task. So what examples can you come up with? In other words, what do you already do in your job, in your role with baby brains? What do you already do to encourage sensory motor development? I'm going to open up the chat room to see if you can fill in some ideas of how we promote sensory motor development. Take about a minute and see if we can flood the chat room. Swinging is excellent. Lots of outdoor time. Out of bed rocking, excellent. Ring around the rosy. Tummy time, yes. Put toys out of reach, and you know that adds a sense of adventure. That's a good one. Patty cake, mini trampoline, peekaboo, absolutely tunnels. My niece and nephew love tunnels. And so all of these activities promote the activation of the vestibular system, which is linked to better reading, writing, learning, and paying attention. So very quickly on your sheet of paper in front of you, the one we've been taking notes on, I'm going to pull the chat down for just a second. If you would please write out vestibular system somewhere on that sheet of paper because it's going to be important. So vestibular system. And so we're going to file that away. So the vestibular system and sensory motor activation. So let's move on to auditory development. So we've got S. Now we're going to move on to A. Please take a look, and you might want to make this full screen because it's good stuff. So for those of you that were curious about the language and learning DVDs, here comes the answer. So in auditory development, which is the second part of our enriched environment, there's dramatic growth during the first year, and most of this comes all the way up to age 5 through experience. What does that mean? It means we actually learn language and we develop our language capacity through experience, direct experience. What's an example of experience? Well, we're talking about hearing words, speaking words, and listening to our parents or guardians or whoever we're around most of the time. What does this do? It actually helps build and develop the language centers of the brain. So there's dramatic growth during the first year. It's based on experience up through age 5, and it must be real live human voices. What's the catch? We know that if the brain is exposed to electronic voices as their primary means of developing language capacity, it does not stimulate the areas of the brain the same way that live voices do. And so in the example of the language and learning DVDs, those are electronic voices and do not provide the same experience and thus impact the development of language capacity. So what are some ways to do this? Well, singing is my personal favorite, even though I'm not very good at it. They do tell me that baby brains cannot distinguish between good singers and bad singers. They all think you're the greatest person in the world anyway. So singing helps with this. And we notice there's a study here on the screen, and this is one of my favorite studies. What happens if we don't provide the experience? Well, this is what happens. We see vocabulary problems. So there's a red dot on your screen that's kind of circling around. Take a look at that study and see what you think of that chart. Take about 17 seconds to look at that chart. So what do we see? When babies and infants are exposed to mothers who talk a lot to them, in other words, they might explain every single thing they're doing. They're changing the diaper. They're just constantly talking to the infant. We see a trajectory of vocabulary development that goes straight up in the air and just shoots through the ceiling. And that's pretty good. These students will come to us with high vocabulary. What happens if the mother doesn't talk to the infant? We see this dotted line here at the bottom. There's a significant difference in vocabulary development. The point being is, from birth to age 5, we develop language capacity through experience. Electronic voices do not provide the experience that real-life voices do. Moral of the story, talk to the babies and the children. Talk to them. So, rather than come up with ideas for this, let's do a quick review. We're going to keep the chat room closed just a second longer, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. What you've got in front of you, your sheet of paper, your neighbor's shirt, the back of your hand, and something to write with. Here are a quick 4 questions. Take just a second and see if you can jot down some quick answers to these 4 questions. If you've got someone in the room with you, talk it out with them. If you're by yourself, talk to yourself. See what you can come up with. Take about a minute to write down some responses to these questions. So let's go over the rapid review time. And for that, we're going to put the chat back up because We need to do something so we can use these keyboards. So rapid review. From birth to age 5, what develops our language capacity? It's a one-word answer. Go ahead and fill in that chat room. What develops our language capacity from birth to age 5? Excellent. So AJ's got a response in. Yes, reading is a type of experience. Perfect. Talking, yes. Absolutely. Exposure is excellent answer. So you're right. From birth to age 5, our language capacity is developed through experience, and experiences include things like reading, listening to human voices, talking, social interaction, and a language-rich environment. Excellent. So number two, what is one super fantastic way to learn new words? It's something I'm not very good at, but it is an absolute blast to do. How can we do this? Number 2. There you go. Singing is excellent. So let's do number 3. Let's take a look at number 3. This is a word that John Medina uses quite often in one of his new books, Brain Rules for Baby. So what is parentese? In other words, what are we talking about when we use the word parentese? If you've got some guesses, fire those into the chat room. Let's see what we can come up with. We got it. Everybody's got an answer. So here, this is excellent. So why do I bring up parentese in this webinar? Well, part of the reason is if you're a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, a favorite cousin, parentese is irresistible. But as early childhood educators, let me say it this way. Beyond 6 months, we probably, in fact, it's pretty definite, we should not use parentese with these baby brains because it certainly doesn't help with brain development as they learn appropriate syntax, intonation, rhyme, and rhythm. So what is parentese? We know what it is. We've got the definition up. It's baby talk. It's the drawing out the words. It's the goo-goo gaga. But let's leave that to parents, cousins, and grandmothers. After age 6, it's very important that they hear us talk as normal adults. And so as early child care providers, physical therapists, speech pathologists, early childhood teachers, some of the folks that popped in the room, it's important that we avoid parentese if possible. Number 4, we won't open that up to the chat room because that's the chart. What happens if we do not talk to children? It's the picture in the bottom right of your screen. It actually impacts their vocabulary development, and that's not a good thing. Not a good thing. So we're actually at about the halfway point through the SAVE acronym. We've covered S. S stands for sensory motor, and we know it activates a part of the brain called the vestibular system. We've taken care of auditory development, and we know that's important because our language develops as a result of experience. And so we're moving on to V and E, and of course V is vision and E is emotion. But before we do, on your white sheet of paper or your sheet of paper in front of you, I'm going to close the chat room for just a moment and give you a chance to work with your writing utensil. If you had 1 or 2 questions that you have buzzing around in your head at this moment, go ahead and get them down on that sheet of paper so we can remember them for the question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So take a second, jot down anything you'd like to ask about based on S and A thus far. Take about a minute to do that. Go. Take about 20 more seconds, and then we're going to move on. Wonderful. So those questions, kind of set those questions aside. We may add to them in just a moment. But set those questions aside, and when the question and answer session pops up at the end of this webinar, that will be your chance to fire off some burning question that you've got inside of your brain. The other part is I'm going to make sure you leave here with my contact information, and if there's something I can answer, or certainly some of the folks that set up this webinar can answer, we would be happy to clear that up, because it would be a shame to spend this time on a webinar during our lunch and not be able to ask questions that are burning in our brain. So we'll make sure that's possible. So let's move on to V. We've covered S, we've covered A, and let's look at V. Please take a look at your screen, and you might want to make it full screen because there's some good stuff on here as well. So vision is one of the parts of the SAVE acronym, or the enriched environment, that makes us a little nervous. So why does it make us a little nervous? Well, because vision is actually one of the reasons that the myth about windows of opportunity, it came from vision research. Because unlike the other parts of SAVE, S, A, and E, vision, if we starve the brain of a variety of stimulating visual input, those networks actually don't develop, and then there's a certain spot in their development where there's nothing else we can do. So, for example, in an extreme case in which a child is neglected and locked in a closet during the early years of their life, we would see impairment to their vision that is irreparable. In other words, we would not be able to reverse the injury. Those are extreme cases, and although rare, it's certainly worth mentioning that if we starve the brain of visual input, there is a possibility that brain development will continue on in a way we don't want it to, and we actually can't do anything about it. So the major advancement takes place sometime after the 4th month, and we can see this in babies. So when you look at babies, we know that their eyes are picking up contrasting lights and dark spaces, but they're not really making out clear images. They're depending on their mother's and father's voices to locate things. So what happens afterwards? Well, there's all kinds of synaptic density and the connection of neurons and the growing together of the networks, and that immediately starts to prune it out to make it more efficient. And so if we don't provide youngsters with a variety of stimulating inputs, we don't provide an environment for the brain to prune things that aren't needed and make it more efficient for things that are needed. So it's extremely important to provide visually stimulating environments. So we're going to shrink our screens down out of full screen because I'm going to open up the chat room. And when I do open the chat room, here's the question I'm after. How can we provide stimulating visual input for little brains? So when I open up the chat room, let's race to fill in some ideas. How do we do this? Go. Colors, mirrors, mobiles, excellent. Picture books. Get out of the house. Absolutely. Pattern recognition. Distinctive patterns. Good. Items that move and can be manipulated. That's important for tracking and later reading. Excellent. Being outdoors. There's nothing beats live images. Excellent. So that's a fantastic list. And so we've got to make sure, and there's a rumor floating around out there, and I'm not sure where it's come from. Lead in the sunshine. Absolutely. Rappahannock. So there's a myth out there that if we put up too much stuff on our walls, if we provide too busy of an environment, that it distracts kids or distracts children. And that's absolutely not true. There are certain times when things in the room are distracting. For example, if you have a poster up of your favorite sports team, and for some reason someone in the room doesn't like that, that can be distracting. If you have a poster up that's slightly inappropriate, that may be distracting. But as far as the list of items that appeared in the chat room just a second ago, our room should be full of contrasting colors, distinctive patterns. Face-to-face contact should be involved constantly. Exposure to different environments, mirrors, mobiles, all of those items need to be visible. If they're not visible, if they're not available, how can we help this? So this is particularly important to home visits. So we go into homes and we take a look at what's going on, and we see that there may be lacking in sensory motor stimulation. There may be not a lot of auditory interaction. There may not be a lot of visual input there. So very quickly in the chat room, what can we do now? In other words, how can we spread this information so that when folks leave us from our centers or our classrooms and go home, we can help spread the word and help parents be involved in this? So very quickly in the chat room, what are some ways that you might spread the information you're getting from this webinar to parents or centers outside of your reach? Take a second, just type some things in that chat room. Right, and so there are a couple of things on there I'd like to point out. Modeling has shown up several times, newsletters, and then the other thing that popped up there, let's see if I can find it because you guys are just rolling out that, is the idea that this doesn't have to be an expensive event. So, for example, there's a lot of push in the market to have these brain-friendly toys that cost bazillions of dollars and break relatively easy. Sometimes the best thing we can do for children is to provide them with a cardboard box, crayons, and a glue stick, and turn them loose. And so this isn't something that requires an expensive event. It just requires an active event. And that is visual stimulation. Good answers. Good answers. So here we go. I promised you at the beginning of the session I would tell you what 6 emotions were hardwired in the brain. So I'm going to pull the chat down for just a second, and I'd like to show you some research on emotion, and then I'm going to share with you the 6 emotions that are hardwired into the brain that we are born with. And you're going to be surprised. It's going to knock your socks off. So take a look at emotion, and you might want to make it full screen. This is why emotions are important. So here's the long and short of emotion. So we see that the first 2 years are very important. We also see that a child learns to express emotions in a social world. This is why we say children don't find their own happiness. They actually have to socially interact and get around folks to learn how to navigate them. We also know that early exposure causes problems in the brain. And by the way, if the brain is worried about stress, then it cannot worry about learning. So we see that a lot of the brain juice, also known as glucose, gets used up for stress and doesn't get used for thinking, and we see that it impairs cognitive development. So it's very important that we take advantage of the time we spend with students, allow them positive social interaction that allows them to practice, 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 and modeling is one of the ways to do this. So here we go. We're going to shrink our screen down. We're going to open up the chat room. And I'm going to type in, one by one, the 6 emotions that are hardwired into the brain. As I type them in, you might want to jot them down on your paper and take them away with you. So here we go. What are the 6 emotions that are hardwired into the brain? The first one is sadness. We are born with the ability to recognize and deal with sadness. Joy is the second one. Disgust is the third one. I'm sure we all could have predicted this one. Anger is the fourth one. There will be no surprise for this one. Surprise is the next one. And finally, fear. These are the 6 emotions that are hardwired into our brain. This is cutting-edge research from a researcher named Ekman, E-C-K-M-A-N. He is a whiz-bang researcher that has discovered we are born with 6 hardwired emotions. So why do I bring this up? Well, he also believes that there are thousands that exist. So we have thousands of emotions that exist, thousands of emotions. But 6 are hardwired. But now you know that the other 994 plus emotions, where do they come from? They come from social experiences and social interaction. Social interactions and practicing these emotions. So very quickly in the chat room, how many emotions are hardwired into the brain? Type in a number. How many are hardwired into the brain? We should be filling up the screen with 6. Excellent. And let's do a quick transition. How many emotions exist out there? Type that in quickly. Excellent. So it means our job early on in life to make sure the brain uses its good juice for learning and not stress is to help students practice, and develop these other emotions. Almost are done. And so what I'm going to do is skip ahead very quickly to a couple of slides that I want to show you because we're going to start winding down. We're going to start winding down, and I want to show you some research that brings this home. So let me close the chat room for a second. Please make your screen full screen, and here's the punchline. Here comes the punchline. Take a look. So why do we care? In other words, why did we just spend our lunch break talking about developing brains? Here's why. Researchers believe, starting in 1997 and nothing between then and now has changed their belief, and instead it's confirmed it. 66% of who we are, which means who our children are, is the result of the environment they're in. 34% is genetics, which means every day that we are involved with the life of a child, we are actually making a significant difference in their brains and their brain development. The research out of neuroscience labs and cognitive psychology labs says there's a way to do this. And it's a single word answer. You've learned that word today. It's SAVE. You provide an environment for these baby brains from 0 to 5 that has sensory motor experiences, auditory experiences, visual stimuli, and emotional support. If we don't provide it, this happens. The take-home message is, do you make a difference, yes or no? The absolute answer is yes. Does the research help us fine-tune that and be better at our jobs? Every single day. So if you're in the room by yourself, please say this to yourself. If you're in the room with colleagues, turn to your colleagues and tell them, you make a difference. So here we go. I am finished. I'd like to share with you my contact information. Share my contact information with you. And then I would like to turn this over for questions because we do, and I'm going to show the chat very quickly. And I appreciate you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have now. And so Dana, I'll ask Dana to step in and moderate how she would like to deal with the question and answer session.
Okay, well, thanks so much, John. This has been fantastic. And thanks to all of you for your patience as we've maneuvered the mute-unmute thing. I think this has been a great webinar, and I want to invite you to ask any questions if you'd like to go ahead and post them in the chat. I see we have one question, John. Will the slides be made available?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm more than happy to share with you a PDF of the slides. I can't do the PowerPoint because some of the pictures are copywritten by the researchers that provided them, but I will certainly give you a PDF that you can hang on a bulletin board.
Okay, and what we'll do then, what we should be able to do with that is when the webinar is archived and posted on the professional development website, we should be able to post the PDF at that time.
Excellent. Dana, can I answer Susan and Doris?
Go right ahead.
That's the million-dollar question. So we know that the longer a brain is in an environment, right, the longer it becomes committed to that environment. And so this is why I think early childhood folks are so important. I mean, we are so vital because here's why. And this is an eco-stroking session, so get ready. But we know that if we wait until they're teenagers or they're middle school students and then try to provide an intervention, the brain's been in the environment for upwards of 12 years. And so changing the brain will be more difficult, take more time and more energy. But if we get to these brains early, we know we can change brains, and the sooner we can get to those brains and change those brains, the better off it is. It's the old philosophy of old habits die hard. Well, the same thing happens with brains. The longer we wait, the harder it is to make the change, which is often why I get frustrated when we cut the budget in early childhood, because it's like pulling the bottom block out of a Jenga game on your first move. The tower's going to come down. So those are great questions.
Hear, hear. I see, John, we've got a couple questions about working with children with hearing and vision loss. And if you have, there's a question about how does this affect the children with hearing or vision loss, and if you have any strategies for working with children.
Absolutely. So visually impaired, hearing impaired, we know that when certain senses aren't on board, that other senses take over. And so if you have a visually impaired student, or a visually impaired child, one of the things I would suggest is a highly tactile environment, and make use of auditory stimulation. So we provide the child a chance to put their hands on anything safely, and practice describing it, practice using words, practice talking about it. And there's some amazing research out of Purdue on providing experiences for folks that are visually impaired. Hearing impaired folks, their visual sense is going to kick into high gear and capitalize on that. Capitalize on words, capitalize on writing out the phonemes, capitalize on all of the opportunities that the other senses offer in place of the one that has the impairment.
Okay, great. We looks like we also have a question about how does one balance a yes environment with establishing boundaries?
So those are actually two separate things, believe it or not. And sometimes we get them confused. I'm terrible with it. I'm terrible with my niece and nephew. I am not good at disciplining them because I want to be the yes uncle and not the no uncle, when in fact that is totally separate. We know that babies and children like structure. And so the trick is to establish boundaries, but make sure that the establishment of boundaries, this child does not emotionally internalize it as something's wrong with them. And so, yes, when it comes to playing and exploring, and then when there is a boundary violation, always end with letting the child know how special, how important they are, and how much you enjoy your time with them. They just can't do what they just did. And that's a hard question to answer in a quick amount of time.
Right. That's probably a webinar in and of itself.
Yeah, and there are folks that actually work on that exact task.
It looks like we have a question about the parentees. If a young child around 6 to 12 months is delayed verbally, is it okay to coach the parents on parentees in that situation?
I would suggest coaching parents on parentees all the time. So yes, absolutely. The reason I'm careful with that is I understand what it's like. I've learned that in the last 2 days. You just can't help yourself. And so I'm always cautious to tell parents what to do because I know how hard that is, but I would coach parents anyway.
So you're saying you would coach them not to use parentees?
I would coach them to use it in moderation and start using adult words as they move on past 6 months. So
okay.
Yeah, I would coach them, absolutely.
Okay. Looks like we've got a couple of questions about some other special situations, about how the 6 hardwired emotions apply to children with autism spectrum disorder, children with premature brains, and children who have been exposed to illegal substances in utero, that's a tall order to cover those 3 areas. But I don't know if you have any resources maybe for people who are working with children with ASD who are preemies.
Absolutely. And with the autism spectrum disorder, we know that they don't have mirror neurons. And so mirror neurons are what allow us to see ourselves in other people's shoes. And so it's an empathy issue at times. There's some amazing research, and I'm actually in my office, and I cannot reach the book to give you the citation, but there are amazing resources on how to teach empathy and how to provide an emotional environment for children with autism. I can certainly pass those resource citations on to Dana. The same thing goes for preemies. We have incredible amounts of new research on preemies. And the last part of that is illegal substances. That's an example of where the outside environment has derailed brain development, and we're going to have our hands full when those babies come out, which means early intervention. Early, persistent intervention is key to that. But illegal substances derail the whole process. Absolutely.
Okay, well, if you have any of those resources, you can send me, John. I'd be happy to post them on the professional development website. We have an autism page and a preemie page, so we can make those available that way. That'd be great. We have Corey asked if you could share the name of that book you mentioned by John Medina again.
It is by John Medina. Actually, you know what? I make you guys use the chat room. Let me give that thing a whirl. So it's John Medina is the author, and the title is Brain Rules for Babies. It is a new book on the market. It is absolutely off the charts amazing. If, when I teach early childhood courses at JMU, it will be the textbook.
Awesome. Great. Okay. Well, we have one more question before we wrap up. It looks like Anna writes, some Part B systems don't find children eligible to receive services if the environment cannot be ruled out as the reason for the delay. What's your opinion about this?
My response would be, without stirring up a hornet's nest, my response would be that we know environments influence brain significantly, and they do it positively and they do it negatively. And so, void of all political pressure, all of that information, do I think children should be eligible if they come from a neglected environment? Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, we are going to have to spend more time, I think, in this country addressing environments, because that's all research is pointing to. Environment. And so, Anna, good luck.
Good luck. That's great. I think we would probably, most all of us on this call probably agree with you there. Well, I'm looking at the clock, and I see that it's 1 o'clock on the dot, so I think we will wrap up. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, John, for your presentation and your time today. And good luck with your new baby.
Great, thank you.
Sure. We're going to wrap up. If you guys have questions after the meeting, you're welcome to email me. John's given you his address. If there's anything we can answer afterwards, feel free to let us know. Y'all have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next month at our next Talks on Tuesday. Bye-bye.